As we considered wisdom as it's truly found in God and can only be given graciously by His hand compared to the worldly wisdom, we at least introduced this. And so let us get into the text. We're going to pick up in verse 14 where he says, "But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking." So remember in verse 13 he said, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy, and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth." Remember, in verse 11, he says, "Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening?" And ultimately, he's going through that same point. You're saying you're professing to be wise, yet, just like Paul said in Romans, through this, you become fools. You become fools. And now your heart is full of bitter envy and self-seeking, and thus do not boast and lie against the truth. Remember, he's also cautioned us against boasting. We boast alone in the Lord. He is the cause for our boasting. We do not boast in and of ourselves. God's people are humble. God's people are meek. Now, humility, let me just introduce this. Humility doesn't mean, it's not this weak man or woman that just kind of takes everything on the cheek and so on. But he's wise. Again, a better reflection of humility is exactly what Jesus says. Be crafty or wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And literally, that word for crafty or wise is the same word in the Septuagint that's used about the serpent in the garden. So, in one way, Jesus is saying, be crafty, be wise, be harmless as doves. Don't be like the serpent. Don't be harmful like the serpent, full of envy and self-seeking. Now, this envy, the word there is actually hedonon, and that's the word from which we get hedonism. Hedonism, simply put, is really the pursuit of pleasure. Now, especially in our age, we really seek happiness. You know, we want the next thing to make us happy, to make us contented. And we think what makes us happy is pleasure, which is kind of rational. You think about it. Why do we sin? Why do we sin? Because it pleases us. We sin because we want to. And it brings pleasure for a time. But true peace, true joy, true happiness can only come from God. He is the object of peace. Again, He is the objective truth, and His Son is the manifestation of that truth. He is the incarnation of peace. He is the incarnation of meekness. He said, "Come to me, for I will lighten your burden. My burden is light, and I will take your yoke upon me." It doesn't make the walk easy, but it makes it more glorious. It makes it more peaceful as He walks with us and alongside of us and in us, residing inside of us. Now, that word for envy is also zeal. I'm sorry, the desire is hedonism. However, the word here for envy is actually also zeal, which, if we can remember Christ in what He did in the temple, John referring back to what was spoken, that zeal for your house consumes me. This is something that the Psalm said. So there is a godly zeal as well. There's a godly jealousy. That's another word for envy. And God is jealous for His people. And again, there's a right kind of jealousy. There's a right kind of zeal. If my wife Sarah, if somebody was trying to make a move on my wife Sarah, I would be jealous. I'm zealous for my marriage, for our relationship. I'm absolutely zealous for this thing, which is good. Now how I act upon it, it might be good or bad, but that kind of zeal is a good zeal. It's a true and godly zeal. But the zeal for others' possessions, this envy and this selfish ambition, that's really a better way of putting this, is not of God and is a fallen zeal. It's interesting, actually, that if you think about the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments of God, where one of the prohibitions is about coveting. Thou shalt not covet. If you think about like any establishment of a nation, and when they're writing our laws, I don't know of one who's added that prohibition, thou shalt not covet. Because the people of God, the children of God, must be and are rich in Christ. We are wealthy. We must be contented. We must be content with who God is and who we are in Him, and thus be peaceable one to another and one with the world. This peace, again, isn't merely to be shown and to be done in church. This is to be done everywhere we go with whomever we come in contact. Now, verse 15, this wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, and demonic. That word sensual isn't necessarily sexual. It doesn't mean merely a sexual appetite. Again, this sensual is really anything that brings us pleasure. And again, that's why the covetousness is so ingrained in that. So this is earthly, sensual, and demonic. Now, earthly is different than earthy. Paul talks about earthy things. Okay, so earthly is what can be found in the earth. Earthy is what can be found of the earth. It is of this world. So ultimately, he's saying this wisdom can be found in the world. It is also of the world, but it is found in the world. It is not found in heaven. This one does not descend from above. This is worldly. You can find this wisdom anywhere in this world. It's sensual, so it only seeks pleasure for its own. And it's demonic. Again, it's set on fire by hell itself. The devil himself gives this wisdom. This is the wisdom that he has. This is the fallen wisdom that, again, you can find readily throughout the world. The wisdom that comes from God is shown by good conduct that are done in the meekness of wisdom. Verse 16, for where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. Now again, that goes back to this zeal. It's the same contrast, okay? So you have this zeal for yourself. You have this envy for yourself, this covetousness for yourself. And yet, the contrast of that is zeal, true devotion and pleasure from the things of God, being pleased, being satisfied, being sanctified by who He is and what He does, His will. We are to celebrate and enjoy and pray for His will to be done on earth, even as it is in heaven. Let's press forward. 17, but the wisdom that is from above, so these are the fruits of worldly, sensual, demonic wisdom, envy and self-seeking, thus confusion and every evil thing. This is what is spawned by the tree of this wisdom. Bad tree can only bear bad fruit. Thus, these are the fruits, if you want to see it that way. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure. Briefly, again, this wisdom isn't a mere intellectual enterprise. It is more to do with the heart and the soul as well. Again, though, nothing comes into the heart except through the mind. But this wisdom, since it is a gift by God, of course, is first pure. So we must seek purity before we can ever seek peace. In order for any of these following fruits to be demonstrated and to manifest, our wisdom must be pure. At every different stage, okay? There's obviously a growth in this purity, okay? But it must be first pure, purely of God and purely from God. Otherwise, it is earthly, sensual, and demonic. So, the fruits though are first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield. That's another illustration of humility. You know, I've had a few different confrontations as a Christian, and true godly wisdom truly yields. truly yields. Again, we are to be harmless as doves, wise as serpents, and harmless as doves. So you yield. You yield. You might know that, the truth and so on, but you yield for the betterment, for the peace with this individual or with these individuals and so on. So, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality. Remember in chapter 2, he's already admonished us and encouraged us against this partiality, and without hypocrisy. So, it's also without hypocrisy. So going back to his streams, okay, it is without hypocrisy. It only springs forth pure water, potable water. It's not a stream, it's not a spring from whence we get pure and salt water. It is either entirely pure or it is entirely salt. It is either of this world and of our flesh and of the devil, or it is divine and thus pure and peaceable, and so on. So again, he's using that illustration leads into this perfectly. I hope we can see that. You have a stream. No stream brings forth, no spring brings forth fresh and bitter waters. Even so, my brethren, bring forth either fruit from this pure wisdom, which is peaceable, willing to yield and so on, or you're demonstrating and you're manifesting this bitter water and yet boasting as if you have this pure wisdom. Do not boast and lie against the truth. So without partiality, so these are the fruits though. First pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Remember, again in James, chapter 1, verse 17 and 18, for every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth. Again, we spoke of this during the introduction, but this is of his own will. This is a gift given by God according to his will, which is why we ask in faith, because we know that this is his desire. This is absolutely according to his divine, gracious, merciful, and loving will. God truly does love his people. So what I said in our previous message about Jesus and God loving every fallen man and woman is nonsense. But he has a special divine affection for his people. And again, also James said in chapter 2, verse 13, for judgment, because these people are judging. Okay, and this is essentially what's going to spark all these quarrels and fights and so forth. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment, and that's why one of the fruits is to be merciful. And this is somewhat of the list of the fruits of the Spirit that comes from Paul as well. A little different, They have different accents. They're both speaking of two distinguishing things. James is speaking of specifically the wisdom that comes from God. These are the fruits. It's first pure and then peaceable, which is not happening in these areas. And that's why we want to go through this with somewhat of a fine-tooth comb before we really get into the 4th and 5th chapter. This is a turn. I see chapter 3 as something of a turn. I mean, we've been encouraged, and some of his language we might not see as favorable in our 21st century perspective and so on. Yet he's direct, but he's also more encouraging than we will see. He seems to be anyway in chapter 4 and chapter 5. So this is a turn. This is a turn where he's actually speaking of specifically what's going on in these churches. Okay. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Another of Jesus' Beatitudes in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew in verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Psalm 34, verse 13 and 14 says, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. Now, this one we've spoken of somewhat often. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who proclaims peace. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It was the mercy that is procured from his salvation, the mercy and the grace that is spawned from the cross, definitely involved judgment. It was judgment that was hanged on a cross. So it was mercy that was not without judgment, but now we are judged through his mercy, through the cross of Jesus Christ, and thus righteous before God. Okay, continuing on though. Who proclaim peace, who brings glad tidings of good things, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Sadly, in many contemporary churches, the sovereignty of man is what's being supposedly preached. We call this preaching. It's not preaching, it's just speaking. Again, it's the wisdom that is earthly, sensual, and demonic. It's that which comes from the devil. We are to gather in the assembly to hear the truth manifested through his word by the sovereignty and the goodwill of God. So this one is who's proclaiming salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Praise be to God, your God reigns. Otherwise, there's no salvation. There's no salvation if God is not sovereign. There's no salvation. Your God reigns. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11. Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruits of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Continuing on in verses 14 and 15 of that same chapter, chapter 12. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Look again. See, this is something we don't want to hear in the churches. We want to be, many in the pews just want their ears to be tickled. The Bible does not do that. It does not do that, okay? James is very direct. He's meek and he's humble, but he's very direct. Look at how Paul speaks to many people. So they're direct. They're not here to tickle your ears. The prophet, the true prophet of God, was never sent to tickle the ears of the people. He was called and often, most often, rejected because the people don't want to hear. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord, looking carefully, so this is the purpose, looking carefully, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. So the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Again, he's going to go into all this infighting within the churches. Okay, and he's ultimately saying the true wisdom is sown in peace by those who make peace, because we make peace because of this actual true divine wisdom, which is first pure and then peaceable. And thus, the fruits, what is manifested, what grows from this, is righteousness. So, again, when we are saved, we're declared righteous before the sight of God. But Hebrews even says, pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Now, we've had this holiness, we've had this righteousness imputed on us. But again, the true walk of the Christian is an ever-perfecting walk. It is growing into the perfection of Christ. And so, when we sow in peace by this true divine wisdom, which is only a gift by God, then the fruit of that is actual righteousness. Righteousness before a holy and righteous and good God, and before the world, before the watching world. However, this is the same righteousness that was despised and rejected by men. So, you will be hated by the world, but you are loved by God. We seek his pleasure. We seek his will, not the will of man, not the will of this world, the flesh, and the devil. We seek his will, and thus his righteousness through his wisdom. Going on to chapter 4. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires? That's the word for hedonism. For pleasure that war in your members? So, again, James in chapter 1, verse 13 through 15, he said, Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So again, where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? Remember what I already said in this first chapter. Brothers and sisters, this is not from God. This is spawned from your own desires, your own seeking after pleasure, your selfish ambition, and your envy. So where do these come from? These come from within. This comes from the wisdom of this age, the wisdom of this world, the wisdom of your fallen heart of a dead tree. Also, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 22, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you, that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Rakah, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. So going on. Now, verse 2, I don't like the translation in the New King James, so I'm going to use the one from the New International Version. It just depends on how you see the tense of the verb, whether it's aorist. And look, we're not going to get into that when we talk about language and specifically how that breaks down. Maybe we'll get into that, but that's what it depends upon. The Greek doesn't really have punctuation, especially in the ancient Greek. That they didn't. So you have to determine what this is. However, in the NIV, it says, you desire but do not have, so you kill. So this is largely what Jesus was getting at, and so this is what James is using. You desire but you do not have, so you kill, just like Jesus said. You covet but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight, just like what James is saying. You do not have because you do not ask God. Now, then he says, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. So he's saying, in one sense, he's kind of given two reasons for which you don't have this. One is you haven't asked for it. You haven't asked for it. Many, sadly, within the church, corporate, don't ask for the good gifts that God is happy to give. One of which is wisdom. So one reason is you don't ask. The other is you don't ask rightly. Again, the double-minded man. In chapter 1, be not a double-minded man. We ask in absolute faith, knowing that God is gracious and benevolent and kind and generous, who gives liberally without reproach the true manifestations, the true gifts that only come from him and that he is pleased to see in you. Lastly, again, that specifically is, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Thus, these quarrels and these infightings that sadly occur within the church, for silly reasons largely. I mean, there are certain causes that are worth contending over. Okay, but there are some, like whether or not we're going to have tacos or chicken in our next Bible study, or if it's going to be at Susie's or Billy's. These things should be, dealt with peaceably, right? But sadly, these cause factions, because these people are like the waves being tossed to and fro, because they're double-minded people. They're both proclaiming to have the wisdom and salvation from God and so forth. However, they're full of envy and selfish ambition. Susie wants it at her house, having tacos, and Billy wants it at his house, having chicken. Right? And so their selfish ambition and their envy, Billy probably doesn't want it to be at Susie's because he likes his house more, he's more comfortable, whatever. And Susie, likewise, another reason. But it's all selfishly motivated. Again, the one who has this true wisdom is willing to yield. is willing to yield, full of grace and mercy. Now lastly, since we began our last session regarding philosophy, Socrates himself said, "All the wisdom of this world is but a tiny raft upon which we must set sail when we leave this earth." This is interesting. If only there was a firmer foundation upon which to stand, perhaps some divine word. The philosophers, yes, were seeking and vainly seeking after ultimate reality, true ultimate reality, and yet these pagans knew if we had a divine word, we would have a firm foundation upon which to stand. But as it is with the wisdom that is found in this world, it's merely a tiny little raft upon which we must go when we leave this world. It's not really worth anything. You get but a fleeting taste of it as you leave this earth. Once your days are past, you get into this tiny vessel that is filled with a little bit of wisdom, a little bit of worldly wisdom. If only we had a firm foundation, some divine word, perhaps some divine word. We stand upon the foundation of the law, the prophets, and the apostolic ministry. Christ is the cornerstone. And each and every brick is built upon this cornerstone. We are becoming that holy temple in glory. Remember, there is no temple. There is no temple. We become the temple, which was his body. Remember, destroy this temple. In 3 days, I will build it up again. We are being grafted in to this temple. He is the cornerstone. The foundation, though, is the divine word of God. We stand upon the objectivity of the truth, of the true truth, as Schaeffer would say, the true and only one truth, as it's found in one place and in one person, the throne of grace, where if we come humbly, meekly, as his children, but asking in faith, knowing who he is and who we are. Again, this is why the worldly wisdom is earthly, sensual, and demonic. Because it has no God. It ultimately has no God. If you do not know God, you do not know yourselves. Most of the world can't answer the question, who am I? This is one of the clearest difference between worldly wisdom and divine wisdom. In the beginning, God. That sets forth an entirely different worldview, a certain worldview upon which you live, upon which you walk, a firm foundation. But if there's just in the beginning, it's a worldly wisdom, it's an earthly wisdom, it's a fallen wisdom, it's a sensual wisdom, it's a demonic wisdom. In the beginning, with no one to begin it, is foolishness. It's obviously foolishness, but again, when you're just self-seeking, when your selfish ambition and your envy is the cause and the byproduct of your wisdom, your supposed wisdom and so on, you have no godliness to show. You have no good works to show. A good tree brings forth good fruit. A bad tree brings forth bad fruit. And every bad tree will be cut down and thrown into the fire. Every good tree. When we stand before Christ, we will be judged still. We won't be condemned, but we will still be judged for every single thing we say and everything we do. So many come and say, didn't we do this in your name? But those who are humble, those who are truly in Christ will come and he will say, you did this. When I was in jail. You visited me when I was naked. You clothed me when I was thirsting. You gave me drink when I was hungry. You fed me. And his true servants, his true brothers and sisters will say, when did we do this? Yes, we do everything in accordance to his good will and to his good pleasure, knowing that we will be judged thereby. But the true saints of God merely bear fruits of his righteousness, not to be saved, not to procure this reward. That's what I'm saying. Jesus sees our intentions. He knows the heart. And so those who say, didn't we do this in your name? Didn't we do that in your name? They expected, when they came before Jesus, they could declare all these works. And these were obviously seen by him and so on, but these were done with envy and selfish ambition. The true wisdom is first pure and then peaceable, and thus manifest these fruits. Unbeknownst to whether, we obviously know knows he sees it, but we do it because we have been given this wisdom that is pure and peaceable, and thus we manifest the goodness and the peace that is our Savior. As we continue this book, we will see some of the downfalls of when the church lacks this true wisdom that comes from God. So, as you continue to study this book, again, this is definitely the most Old Testament of the New Testament books. Chapter 4 specifically is very reflective of the poetic structure of the wisdom literature, which God willing we will see as the weeks go by. But see these as not harsh condemnations. These are exhortations. These are encouragements. Be not like the wisdom, have not the wisdom of this world. It's a fallen wisdom. That's a fallen wisdom. And there's no boasting in true divine wisdom. Let he who boasts, boast in this. Let he who glories, glory in this, that he knows the Lord. That's what God says. This is what pleases me. This is what pleases him. We boast only in him and in his grace, in his great holy name.